An unlikely act of kindness. A little girl with nothing to give, and a man who'd lost everything. But what happens when their lives cross paths in a way no one could have imagined? She gave him a coat, but what he gave her in return would change both their futures forever. This is a story about hope, second chances, and the ripple effects of compassion. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The streets of Harper's Hollow, a small town in rural Georgia, were eerily quiet under the icy grip of winter. Once bustling storefronts now stood abandoned, their faded signs creaking in the wind. Shuttered windows and empty sidewalks painted a picture of a community left behind, struggling to survive in a world that seemed to have forgotten it. 11-year-old Daisy Carter clutched her school books tightly to her chest, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The coat she wore was 2 winters too small, its thin fabric doing little to shield her from the cold. Her boots, scuffed and patched, crunched against the frosted ground as she hurried home, eager to escape the biting wind. As Daisy turned onto Maple Lane, her steps faltered. Ahead, a group of boys had gathered near a broken bench. They jeered and laughed, their voices sharp and cruel. One boy, Caleb Rice, a familiar bully from school, picked up a rock and hurled it toward a huddled figure on the bench. "Go find a real home, you bum!" Caleb shouted, his words met with laughter from the others. The figure on the bench flinched, pulling a tattered blanket tighter around his thin frame. Daisy's heart clenched at the sight. She recognized the man as Raymond Taggart, someone she'd seen wandering the streets before. His sunken cheeks and trembling hands spoke of hunger and cold, a desperation that couldn't be ignored. "Leave him alone!" Daisy's voice rang out, cutting through the boys' laughter. She stepped forward, her small figure standing firm against the group. Caleb turned, surprised at first, then sneering. "What's it to you, Carter? You gonna save him?" Daisy squared her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. "He hasn't done anything to you. Go away." The boys hesitated. Caleb scowled but eventually tossed the remaining rock aside. "Whatever. He's not worth it." He shoved his hands in his pockets, glaring at Daisy. "You'll regret this." As the boys retreated, Daisy approached the man on the bench. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, crouching down to his level. Raymond looked up, his eyes bloodshot but filled with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though his shivering frame said otherwise. Daisy began gathering the scattered items the boys had knocked from his makeshift shelter. A small bag, a worn hat. "Here," she said, handing them to him. He hesitated before taking them, his hands trembling as they brushed hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Most people, they just look the other way." Daisy shook her head. "It's not right what they did." She glanced at the blanket barely covering him and frowned. "Do you have anywhere warm to go?" Raymond shook his head. "Not anymore." His gaze drifted to the ground. "I used to. I had a family, a home. Lost it all." Daisy's heart ached at the sadness in his voice. She didn't know what to say, but her determination grew. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said, "with something better for you." "I promise." Raymond's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "You're a good kid. Thank you for seeing me." As Daisy walked away, the weight of what she had witnessed settled over her. The cold seemed sharper now, cutting through the thin fabric of her coat. Her neighborhood was far from perfect, but it offered her a kind of warmth Raymond didn't have. A home, a mother waiting for her, the small comforts she often took for granted. The clouds above parted briefly, letting a weak ray of sunlight fall on the frosted streets. Daisy looked up, taking it as a small sign of hope. When Daisy finally reached her home, she pushed open the creaky front door to find her mother, Ruth, slumped over at the kitchen table, fast asleep. The dim light of a flickering lamp cast soft shadows across the room, illuminating the fabric and threads scattered around Ruth's sewing machine. Daisy set her books down quietly, careful not to wake her mother. She stepped closer, noticing the weariness etched into Ruth's face, her hands resting motionless on a half-finished seam. With gentle movements, Daisy retrieved a worn but warm quilt from the back of a nearby chair. She draped it over Ruth's shoulders, tucking it around her carefully, as if afraid the slightest rustle might disturb her. Daisy stood for a moment, watching her mother breathe steadily. "Good night, Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She walked to her small bedroom, where the familiar sight of her piggy bank greeted her from the nightstand. Its chipped paint didn't dull the excitement it represented. A dress for Ruth's birthday, a small token to make her mother smile. Daisy ran her fingers over the cool surface of the bank and let out a soft, contented sigh. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she looked out the frosty window. The night felt quiet and still, but her heart felt light. A smile curved her lips as she imagined the look on Ruth's face when she opened her gift. "I can't wait," Daisy murmured to herself, pulling her own blanket up tightly as she lay down. The anticipation of her mother's happiness filled her with warmth, carrying her into a peaceful sleep. The pale morning sun peeked through the blinds, casting soft rays onto the worn wooden floor of the Carter home. Daisy woke to the familiar hum of her mother's sewing machine, a rhythmic sound that had long been the soundtrack to her mornings. Sliding out of bed, she padded to the kitchen, where Ruth sat hunched over a pile of fabric at the small table. Her needle moved swiftly, stitching life into yet another garment destined for someone else. "Morning, Mama," Daisy greeted, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," Ruth replied with a tired smile, pausing just long enough to pour Daisy a cup of warm tea. "Toast is on the counter." The breakfast was modest, 2 slices of toast spread thinly with jam, but Ruth hummed softly as they ate, her presence filling the room with quiet comfort. Daisy noticed the deep lines around her mother's eyes and the stiffness in her hands, but she said nothing. When breakfast was done, Daisy slipped into her coat, grabbed her school bag, and hesitated for a moment by the pantry. She remembered her promise to Raymond and quickly wrapped a sandwich in wax paper. Her hand lingered briefly on the thermos her mother used to keep her tea warm. Daisy filled it with the little tea they had left, tucking it carefully into her bag. The park was quiet when Daisy arrived. Frost clung stubbornly to the blades of grass, and the trees stood bare against the cold sky. Near a lamppost, Raymond sat hunched under his blanket, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. "Mr. Raymond?" Daisy called out gently as she approached. His head lifted slowly, his eyes squinting against the light. "You again," he said with a faint smile. "Didn't think I'd see you." "I said I'd come back," Daisy replied, pulling the sandwich and thermos from her bag. She handed them to him without hesitation. "It's not much, but it's warm." Raymond stared at the items in his hands, his expression wavering between gratitude and disbelief. "Why would you do this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because I can," Daisy said simply. He nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he unscrewed the thermos. The rising steam seemed to soften the lines of worry etched into his face. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Daisy sat on the edge of the bench, watching as he took his first bite of the sandwich. She hesitated before asking, "Do you have anyone? Family, maybe?" Raymond's chewing slowed, and he lowered the sandwich. "Had a family once, a daughter. She was everything to me," he said, his voice trailing off. "What happened?" Daisy asked softly. Raymond shook his head, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I lost her. Lost all of it." The sadness in his voice made Daisy's heart ache, but she didn't press further. Instead, she said, "You know, everyone deserves to feel like they matter, even if it's just for a little while." Raymond looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't speak, and then he said, "You're a good kid. I don't know why you care, but thank you." By the time Daisy arrived at school, the bell had already rung. She slipped into her seat as quietly as she could, but the whispers started almost immediately. "Where were you?" Caleb Rice smirked from across the room. "Feeding your bum friend again?" Daisy ignored him, keeping her head down as she pulled out her books. "Enough, Caleb," Mrs. Green said sharply, but the damage was done. Devin Marshall, a boy who rarely got involved in classroom drama, leaned over to whisper to Daisy, "Don't listen to him. What you're doing is brave." Daisy glanced at him, offering a small, grateful smile before returning to her work. That evening, Daisy helped her mother with chores around the house. The two worked side by side, folding laundry and sweeping the floor. "How was school?" Ruth asked, glancing over at Daisy. "It was fine," Daisy replied quickly. She didn't mention Caleb's teasing or her visit to Raymond. Instead, she asked, "Do you think it's okay to help people, even if it's hard?" Ruth paused, her expression softening. "Helping is always the right thing, sweetheart, but it's not always easy. You just have to decide if it's worth it." Daisy nodded, mulling over her mother's words. That night, as the frost began to settle on the windows, Daisy lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts wandered back to Raymond, the way his hands had trembled as he held the thermos, the sadness in his voice when he spoke of his daughter. She wondered if what she was doing would make any real difference. The world felt so big, and her efforts so small. But then she remembered the way Raymond had smiled when he thanked her, and a quiet sense of pride filled her heart. In the park, Raymond sat hunched on the bench, the blanket draped over his shoulders, doing little to shield him from the biting cold. He cradled the thermos in his hands, its lingering warmth seeping through his fingers. The tea inside, though nearly finished, was a comfort he hadn't felt in years. Simple, soothing, and made sweeter by the kindness it represented. He took the final sip, savoring the way it chased away the chill in his throat, and set the empty thermos beside him. His eyes drifted toward the horizon, where the darkened sky began to give way to faint hues of deep blue and silver. The stars above, though distant, seemed clearer tonight, as if daring to shine brighter against the cold. Now Raymond didn't feel entirely invisible. The memory of Daisy's small, determined face stayed with him. The way her eyes had looked at him, not with pity, but with something gentler, something that made him feel human again. He let out a breath, watching it swirl and dissipate in the frosty air. The park was silent except for the occasional rustle of bare branches in the wind, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. The loneliness he'd carried for years felt a little less suffocating, replaced by something he almost didn't recognize. A flicker of hope, small and fragile, yes, but undeniably present, like the first ember of a fire waiting to be kindled. Raymond pulled the blanket tighter around himself and leaned back against the bench. He allowed himself to imagine the possibility of something better. It was a faint light in the distance, but tonight, that was enough. The morning light spilled through the thin curtains of the Carter home, casting a soft glow on the modest kitchen. It was quiet except for the familiar hum of Ruth's sewing machine. Daisy stirred in her bed, slowly waking to the comforting sound. Today was a rare day off from school, an unexpected holiday due to maintenance work in the old building. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, Daisy slipped out of bed, the cool floorboards sending a chill up her spine. She padded to the kitchen, where her mother sat at the table, hunched over her sewing. "Morning, Mama," Daisy greeted, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning, sweetheart," Ruth replied without looking up, her hands deftly moving fabric through the machine. On the table between them sat two steaming bowls of soup. The rich scent of broth filled the small room, blending with the faint hum of the sewing machine, which had finally been silenced for a rare break. Ruth blew gently on her spoon before taking a small sip, her movements deliberate and measured. Across from her, Daisy stared into her bowl, lost in thought. The silence stretched, comfortable but heavy, until Daisy broke it with a question that had been swirling in her mind all morning. "Mama, what do you dream about when you have time to think for yourself?" Ruth paused mid-sip, tilting her head as if the question had caught her off guard. "Dreams?" she repeated, setting her spoon down gently. "Oh, I don't know, Daisy. I guess I don't think about them much anymore." Daisy frowned slightly, her young face shadowed by concern. "But if you did," she pressed, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Ruth leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the small window above the sink. For a moment her eyes seemed far away, searching through memories and wishes she hadn't allowed herself to dwell on in years. "I suppose," Ruth began, her voice soft but steady, "I'd like to rest. Maybe take a day where I don't have to worry about bills or work, or whether we have enough for the week." She smiled faintly, turning her attention back to Daisy. "And if I'm dreaming big, maybe a pretty dress to wear to church. Something that makes me feel She trailed off, her smile deepening but tinged with longing. I don't know, special, I guess. Daisy's chest tightened at the words. She blinked quickly, willing herself not to let the emotion show. I think you deserve all of that, she said earnestly, her voice trembling just slightly. Ruth looked at her daughter, her expression shifting to one of pure, quiet love. She reached across the table, her hand warm and rough from years of work, and squeezed Daisy's smaller one. Thank you, sweetheart. But right now, all I want is for you to have the opportunities I never did. That's what really matters to me. Her words stopped abruptly as her gaze shifted to the nightstand. There, her piggy bank sat, a quiet sentinel over her dreams. Daisy didn't touch it, not yet. But the thought was there, lingering like the faint scent of soup still wafting from the kitchen. That night, as the frost began to settle outside, Daisy lay in bed listening to the hum of Ruth's sewing machine. It had become a lullaby of sorts, a sound that promised perseverance in the face of hardship. Daisy closed her eyes, her mother's words echoing in her mind. I'd like to rest, and maybe a pretty dress. A small smile tugged at Daisy's lips. She didn't know how, but she vowed to make those dreams come true. For now, though, she drifted into sleep, imagining a day where her mother could have all the rest and beauty she deserved. Winter tightened its grip on Harper's Hollow, the cold penetrating deeper into every crevice of the small town. Frost clung stubbornly to windows, turning them into frosty canvases etched with nature's delicate patterns. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional car rumbling past, its exhaust puffing clouds into the icy air. Daisy trudged to school, her breath visible with every step. She wrapped her thin coat tightly around her, wishing the threadbare fabric offered more protection from the biting wind. Around her, other children walked in thick jackets and scarves, their cheeks red from the cold but their bodies shielded. Daisy's exposed hands burned with the chill, a stark reminder of what her family couldn't afford. She glanced down at her scuffed boots, each step crunching against the frozen ground. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, working tirelessly at home to keep them afloat. Daisy knew Ruth would never complain, but the strain of their struggles was always visible in her weary eyes. On her way home, Daisy decided to take the shortcut through the park, though the path felt colder and lonelier in the starkness of winter. The skeletal trees stood bare against the iron-gray sky, their spindly branches clawing at the heavens as if begging for warmth. The frosted grass crunched beneath her boots, each step echoing faintly in the still air. As she neared the familiar bench, her pace slowed. There, huddled beneath a tattered blanket, was Raymond. His figure was almost unrecognizable against the desolate backdrop, a small bundle of fabric and frailty battling against the encroaching cold. "Mr. Raymond?" Daisy called softly, hesitant as she approached. Her voice broke the silence like a fragile thread snapping. Raymond stirred slightly, his head lifting with effort. His pale face appeared drawn, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced than before. His movements were sluggish, as though every ounce of strength had been sapped by the relentless chill. "Hey, kid," he mumbled, offering a weak smile that failed to reach his eyes. His breath escaped in shallow, uneven puffs, visible in the icy air. Daisy crouched beside him, her heart sinking as she took in the sight before her. His hands, exposed and raw from the cold, trembled as he tried to pull the thin blanket more tightly around his shoulders. His fingers were so stiff that even this small movement seemed to cost him dearly. "Are you okay?" Daisy asked gently, her voice trembling. She already knew the answer, but hoped he might say something to ease the growing knot in her chest. Raymond chuckled faintly, a sound devoid of humor. "I'm fine, kiddo. Just colder than usual." But the faint blue tin on his lips, the brittle shake in his voice, and the way his body curled into itself told a story he wasn't willing to admit. "You don't look fine," Daisy said, biting her lip. She studied him with a mix of concern and determination, her small frame feeling the weight of his suffering. Raymond's gaze dropped to the frozen ground, his words barely audible. "This weather, it's tougher than most years, but I'll manage. Always have." His words carried a hollow resolve, a quiet resignation that cut deeper than the winter air. Daisy clenched her hands into fists, her thoughts racing as she looked at him. This man who had no one, who tried to reassure her even when the evidence of his suffering was undeniable. "Mr. Raymond," she started, her voice catching. She hesitated, torn between her desire to help and the helplessness of not knowing how. Raymond glanced up at her, his expression softening despite his exhaustion. "You're a good kid," he said quietly, "but don't worry yourself too much about me. I'll make it through, just like always." Daisy felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. I'll, I'll see you tomorrow, okay?" she said finally, her voice steadying even as emotions churned inside her. Raymond nodded slowly, his lips twitching into something that resembled gratitude. "Okay, kid, tomorrow." As Daisy turned and walked away, she glanced back once, her breath fogging the air in uneven puffs. The image of Raymond, small and shivering beneath his tattered blanket, burned into her mind. The cold seemed to cut deeper as she made her way home, her thoughts consumed by the fragile man she left behind. Daisy sat at the kitchen table, her homework untouched. Ruth noticed her distracted demeanor and paused her sewing, tilting her head in concern. "You've been quiet tonight," Ruth said. "Something on your mind?" Daisy hesitated, twirling her pencil between her fingers. "I saw someone today, someone who looked like they needed help. I don't know if it's my place to do anything." Ruth set her work aside and leaned forward, her expression soft. "Sometimes, sweetheart, the hardest choices are the ones where you don't come first, but that doesn't mean they're the wrong ones." Daisy looked up, her mother's words settling into her heart. "But what if I can't do enough?" Ruth smiled faintly. "Even small things can mean the world to someone. You might be surprised how far a little kindness can go." The next day at school, Daisy confided in Devin Marshall during lunch. Sitting beside him on the bench in the courtyard, she shared a simplified version of her dilemma, careful to keep Raymond's identity private. Devin listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. When Daisy finished, he looked at her with quiet admiration. "You're the kind of person who makes the world better, Daisy," he said. "Trust yourself. You'll know what to do." His words gave her a measure of comfort, though the weight of the decision still loomed large. That evening, Daisy sat cross-legged on her bed, the dim glow of her bedside lamp casting soft shadows across her small room. In her hands, she held her piggy bank, its chipped surface worn smooth from years of her careful touch. It felt heavier tonight, not just with coins, but with the weight of the decision she knew she had to make. She turned it slowly in her hands, the familiar sound of coins shifting inside, stirring a bittersweet ache in her chest. This wasn't just a piggy bank, it was her promise to her mother, a quiet symbol of love she'd poured every saved penny into. Closing her eyes, Daisy let herself imagine the moment she'd been dreaming of for months, her mother's face lighting up as she unfolded a beautiful dress, one that made her feel special, if only for a day. Daisy's heart warmed at the thought, but the vision didn't last. Instead, another image forced its way in. Raymond shivering beneath his threadbare blanket, his trembling hands clutching at the cold air, his pale face, the faint blue of his lips. It was a sight that refused to leave her mind. Daisy swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the piggy bank as her thoughts clashed in a storm of guilt and longing. "What kind of person would I be if I turned away from someone who needs me now?" she whispered into the quiet. Her voice cracked as she added, "But what kind of daughter would I be if I let Mama down?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Daisy stared at the bank, her hands trembling. The question lingered in the stillness, as if waiting for her to answer. A tear slipped down her cheek, landing on the piggy bank's chipped surface. Daisy wiped it away quickly, inhaling sharply as she steadied herself. "Mama always says kindness matters," she murmured. Maybe this is the right kind of kindness." With a resolve that felt heavier than her small frame should carry, Daisy placed the piggy bank gently on her lap. She reached for the small hammer in her desk drawer, her hands shaking as she brought it down. The soft crack of porcelain breaking echoed through the quiet room, the sound sharp yet strangely final. Coins spilled out, scattering across her bedspread in a shimmering cascade. Daisy stared at them for a moment, her chest tightening with both relief and sorrow. She began gathering the coins into a small pouch, her fingers working methodically, even as her vision blurred with unshed tears. Each coin felt like a piece of her own heart, given willingly, but not without pain. When she was done, Daisy clutched the pouch to her chest, exhaling slowly. Her heart felt heavy, but within that weight, there was a flicker of something else. Hope. Maybe this is what Mama would want, she whispered into the quiet. Her lips curved into a faint but determined smile. The next evening, Daisy visited the local thrift store. She carefully browsed the racks, searching for the warmest coat within her budget. She chose a thick wool coat, a pair of gloves, and a scarf, each one sturdy and practical. At the register, the cashier, an older woman named Mrs. Leona, watched as Daisy counted out her coins with meticulous care. "You're doing something special, aren't you?" Mrs. Leona said with a knowing smile. Daisy nodded shyly. Mrs. Leona added a pair of wool socks to the bag. "On the house," she said. "Whoever it's for is lucky to have you." Then Daisy walked briskly to the park, her arms wrapped tightly around a paper bag. The icy wind bit at her cheeks, but she barely noticed it. Her focus set on the bench where she knew Raymond would be. The bare trees cast long, skeletal shadows across the frozen ground as she approached. Raymond sat slumped on the same bench, his frail frame almost hidden beneath the threadbare blanket he clutched around his shoulders. His head was bowed, his breath forming faint clouds in the frigid air. "Mr. Raymond," Daisy called gently, her voice carrying warmth that seemed to cut through the cold. He looked up slowly, his eyes dull with exhaustion. But when they landed on Daisy, a flicker of surprise and life stirred within them. She stepped closer, holding the bag tightly to her chest. "I brought something for you," Daisy said, her voice soft yet resolute. Raymond's hands trembled as he reached out, taking the bag with a mixture of hesitation and gratitude. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Just something to keep you warm," Daisy replied. Raymond opened the bag carefully as though afraid it might vanish if he moved too quickly. His breath hitched as he pulled out a thick coat, followed by gloves, a scarf, and a pair of wool socks. His weathered hands traced the material, his fingers lingering on the softness of the fabric. His lips quivered as he tried to speak, but no words came out. Finally, he looked up at Daisy, tears welling in his tired eyes. I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You don't have to say anything," Daisy said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You deserve to be warm." Raymond clutched the coat to his chest, the tears spilling freely down his cheeks now. "Nobody's done something like this for me. Not in years. I don't know how to thank you." Daisy reached into her bag again, pulling out a small container wrapped in a napkin. "I brought this too," she said, handing it to him. "It's just some soup I got from the diner on the way here. I thought, I thought it might help." Raymond took the container with both hands, holding it like it was the most precious thing he'd ever received. The rising steam brought a flicker of warmth to his cold, ravaged face, and he nodded, his words lost to the weight of his emotions. From a distance, Harold Jenkins sat in his car parked along the curb, the heater humming faintly as he sipped on a cup of lukewarm coffee. A veteran journalist for Harper's Hollow Gazette, he had grown weary of assignments like this. Another story about homelessness, another series of numbers and sad statistics no one seemed to care about. He rubbed his temple, staring at the blank notebook on the passenger seat. "What's the point?" he muttered to himself, his voice laced with frustration. The town was crumbling under economic decline, and stories like these felt like drops in a bucket with a hole at the bottom. Lifting his camera lazily, Harold scanned the park through the lens, looking for something, anything, that might bring life to the piece. That's when he saw her. A young girl, no more than 11 or 12, approached a hunched figure on the bench. Harold adjusted the focus. His interest piqued. The girl carried a bag close to her chest, her thin frame wrapped in a coat that seemed barely sufficient for the winter chill. Through the lens, Harold watched her lean down and hand the bag to the man. The man, homeless, Harold guessed from his tattered blanket, looked up, his face a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The girl smiled, a quiet but unmistakable warmth radiating from her expression. Click. Harold snapped a photo, the sound sharp in the silence of his car. He watched as the man pulled out a thick coat, gloves, and a scarf, his hands trembling as he held them. The girl said something Harold couldn't hear, her voice soft, her demeanor earnest. Harold felt a stir of genuine curiosity. He adjusted the camera again, capturing the man's tears, the girl's calm resolve, and the stark contrast between the act of kindness and the unforgiving winter landscape. As Daisy stood to leave, she turned back one last time. "Stay warm, Mr. Raymond," she said with a small smile. Raymond nodded, pulling the coat around his shoulders and slipping the gloves onto his trembling hands. "Thank you, Daisy," he said, his voice soft, but filled with a depth of gratitude words couldn't fully capture. Walking home, Daisy felt the cold settle deeper into her skin, but her heart was warm. She didn't know if what she'd done would change anything, but for now it was enough. Harold followed at a distance as the girl left the park, her steps purposeful but unhurried. She turned onto a modest street lined with small, weathered homes, disappearing into one with peeling paint and a sagging porch. He parked a block away, jotting down the address, his mind already racing with questions. Who was she? What had driven her to help a man so clearly forgotten by the world around him? And how could someone so young seem so sure of what needed to be done? Inside the house, Daisy placed the empty piggy bank in a drawer, its absence on her nightstand leaving a hollow space. She exhaled slowly, unsure of how to explain what she had done to her mother. At dinner, Ruth noticed Daisy's quiet demeanor. "You've been awfully thoughtful today," she remarked, setting down her fork. "Something on your mind?" Daisy hesitated, her fingers toying with the edge of the tablecloth. "Just thinking about school," she said vaguely. Ruth studied her daughter for a moment, but decided not to press further. "Well, just remember, you don't have to carry the weight of the world, sweetheart. That's what I'm here for." Daisy forced a small smile, but her thoughts remained elsewhere, on Raymond, the coat, and the choice she'd made. Meanwhile, Raymond sat on the bench, his trembling hands running over the material of the coat. It was thick and sturdy, far warmer than anything he'd owned in years. He slipped on the gloves, flexing his fingers in their snug embrace. The scarf was soft against his neck, and when he unfolded the socks tucked at the bottom of the bag, a faint laugh escaped his lips. "Socks, too," he murmured, his voice cracking. She thought of everything. For a long time, he simply sat there, holding the coat close. "It's been a long time since anyone cared this much," he whispered. Tears blurred his vision, but they weren't just from the cold. Back at the Gazette's office, Harold uploaded the photos to his computer. As the images filled the screen, he leaned back in his chair, studying each one closely. The girl's face, so open, so unguarded, was a stark contrast to the guarded expressions of the adults Harold was used to interviewing. There was no calculation in her gesture, no expectation of praise, just kindness, pure and simple. Determined to learn more, Harold began calling local schools. It didn't take long to find someone who knew the girl. Mrs. Green, a teacher at Harper Elementary, agreed to pass along Harold's contact information to her mother. The next evening, Ruth answered the phone to hear Harold's voice on the other end. "Mrs. Carter, my name is Harold Jenkins. I'm a journalist with the Harper's Hollow Gazette, and I'd like to talk to you about your daughter." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. "What's she done?" she asked, her tone cautious. "It's nothing bad," Harold assured her. "I saw her in the park helping someone in need. I think it's a story people need to hear." Ruth hesitated. She wasn't comfortable with strangers poking into their lives, but Harold's tone was earnest. "Let me talk to Daisy first," she said finally. "I'll let you know." After the call, Ruth sat down with Daisy. "A journalist called about you today," she said, watching Daisy's eyes widen. "He said you helped someone at the park. Do you want to tell me what happened?" Daisy bit her lip, then nodded. She told Ruth about Raymond, the coat, the cold, and why she felt she couldn't ignore him. I couldn't walk away, Mama," she finished, her voice quiet but firm. Ruth's expression softened, her heart swelling with pride. "You did a good thing, Daisy," she said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "But remember, we do good because it's right, not because we want people to notice." 2 days later, Harold sat at the Carter's kitchen table, his notepad open. The house was modest, the furniture well-worn but clean. Ruth served coffee while Daisy sat beside her, nervously fiddling with her hands. "What made you want to help that man?" Harold asked gently. Daisy took a deep breath. "It didn't feel right to have something extra when someone else didn't even have enough," she said simply. Harold scribbled in his notebook, his chest tightening at the honesty in her words. He left the Carter home feeling unexpectedly moved, as though he'd been reminded of something he'd forgotten a long time ago. That night, Harold sat at his desk, the words flowing effortlessly as he wrote the first draft of his article. He titled it, "A Little Girl with a Big Heart." Harold felt a spark of hope as he shut off his computer. Maybe, just maybe, stories like this still mattered. The morning edition of the Harper's Hollow Gazette hit the stands with little fanfare, as it always did. The modest paper rarely carried anything more than local interest stories. A road repair here, a fundraiser there. But tucked on page 3 beneath a somber headline about the town's struggles with homelessness was Harold Jenkins's newest article, "A Little Girl with a Big Heart." The piece was accompanied by a photo of Daisy, her face framed by her fraying scarf, handing a coat to Raymond on a frostbitten bench. Harold's words painted a picture not just of the act itself, but of what it symbolized, an unyielding light of kindness in a town gripped by cold and despair. By mid-morning, the Gazette's website was flooded with comments. "Daisy's compassion reminds me of the goodness we've forgotten," one person wrote. "She's a hero. We need more people like her," another added. But not everyone shared the sentiment. Skeptical voices began to emerge. Why help someone who can't help themselves? "That man probably brought this on himself," one comment read. "It's a nice story, but where was this kid's mom? Shouldn't she be saving for her own family?" The reactions reflected a divided community, one eager to celebrate kindness and another hardened by years of economic struggle. When Daisy arrived at school the next morning, she immediately noticed the change. The hallway, usually filled with the dull hum of morning chatter, seemed to hum with a different energy. Whispers trailed behind her like an unseen shadow, and curious glances followed her as she made her way to her locker. "Hey, Daisy!" a voice called out. She turned to see Devin Marshall approaching, his usual shy demeanor replaced with an excited grin. "You're famous!" Daisy blinked, confused. "What?" Devin held up his phone, showing her Harold Jenkins' article. "This, everyone's talking about it. What you did for that man, it's incredible." Daisy's cheeks flushed, a mix of pride and discomfort. "It wasn't a big deal," she said softly, adjusting her scarf. "He needed help, so I helped." Devin's grin widened. "Well, it was a big deal. You're a hero, Daisy." Before she could respond, another voice cut through the chatter, sharp and mocking. "Oh, look," Caleb Rice sneered, leaning against a locker with his arms crossed. "It's Saint Daisy, savior of the bums." A group of his friends snickered behind him, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Daisy froze, the warmth from Devin's praise quickly replaced with a chill. "Don't you have anything better to do, Caleb?" Devin shot back, stepping protectively beside Daisy. Caleb smirked, his eyes glinting with mischief. "What?" "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. She probably did it for attention. Wanted to be in the paper, huh, Daisy?" Daisy felt her cheeks burn as she stared at the floor, willing herself to stay calm. She clutched her books tightly, her heart pounding. "Leave her alone, Caleb," Devin said, his voice steady but firm. "At least she's doing something good. What have you done lately?" Caleb straightened, his smirk faltering for a moment before he recovered. "I don't need to play hero to feel important." "No," Devin shot back, his voice louder now. "You just tear people down to make yourself feel bigger. Guess what? It doesn't work." The hallway grew quieter as students stopped to watch the exchange. Caleb's face darkened, his bravado slipping under the weight of so many eyes. With a dismissive shrug, he muttered, "Whatever," and stalked off, his friends trailing behind him. Devin turned to Daisy, his expression softening. "Don't let him get to you. He's just jealous he doesn't have the guts to do what you did." Daisy gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Devin. I appreciate it." As she walked to class, the weight of the morning lingered, a mix of pride and unease. While she was thankful for Devon's support, the attention, both good and bad, felt overwhelming. By lunchtime, Caleb's mocking words still echoed in her mind, but she reminded herself why she'd acted in the first place. It wasn't for recognition or praise. It was because it was the right thing to do. Devon caught up with her in the cafeteria, sitting beside her at their usual table. "You're handling this better than I would," he said with a chuckle. Daisy shrugged. "It's not about what people think. It never was." Devon nodded, admiration clear in his expression. "Well, for what it's worth, I think what you did was brave. Don't forget that." Daisy's smile returned, small but genuine. "Thanks, Devon. That means a lot." Despite the stares and whispers that lingered throughout the day, Daisy felt a quiet strength growing within her. She didn't need everyone to understand her actions. She only needed to know that she'd made a difference. At home, Ruth read the article slowly, her brow furrowed. The words filled her with pride but also unease. She could already see the potential for judgment, people assuming things about their family, prying into their lives. "Daisy," Ruth began gently during dinner, "I read the article about you and Raymond." Daisy froze, her fork hovering over her plate. "You did?" Ruth nodded. "I'm proud of you. But I need you to remember something. We do good because it's right, not because of how it looks. Don't let other people's opinions change why you did what you did." Daisy's shoulders relaxed. "I know, Mama. I wanted to help." "And you did," Ruth said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. In the park, Raymond sat on the bench, the newspaper folded in his lap. He traced the photo of Daisy with his finger, his throat tightening. "It's been a long time since anyone's looked at me like I mattered," he muttered to himself. But along with the gratitude came unease. The article brought memories rushing back, of the life he'd lost, the daughter he'd failed. His chest tightened as he wondered if he truly deserved the second chance Daisy had given him. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his bag, whispering, "I'll make it count." As the article gained traction online, it caught the attention of a regional newspaper. Within days, Daisy's story began circulating beyond Harper's Hollow, reaching neighboring towns and inspiring a wave of interest in the community's needs. A local church group contacted Harold, offering to organize a fundraiser to help the homeless. Harold, buoyed by the response, began researching more stories like Daisy's, determined to shine a light on the town's struggles and its resilience. In the park, Raymond noticed more people stopping to offer blankets and food to those in need. He sat a little straighter on the bench, watching the change with quiet hope. The attention wasn't all positive. Some townspeople voiced their opposition to the sudden focus on the homeless population, claiming it would encourage dependency. The murmurs of dissent reached the school, where Caleb's mocking grew louder. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said to Daisy one day after class. "Bet you're just waiting for someone to hand you a medal." Daisy felt her cheeks burn, but Devon stepped in again, standing tall beside her. "If helping people makes her better than you, maybe it's because she is," he said sharply. Caleb scowled but said nothing more, slinking away with a dismissive wave of his hand. At his desk, Harold leaned back in his chair, the soft glow of his computer screen illuminating the stacks of papers and notebooks scattered across his workspace. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the notes in front of him, his mind whirring with ideas. Daisy's story lingered in his thoughts, not just as a heartwarming tale, but as a reminder of what journalism could do, how it could touch lives and spark something greater. For years, Harold had written stories about the town's struggles, the businesses that had closed, the families forced to leave, and the rising numbers of homeless individuals seeking refuge in Harper's Hollow. Those articles, though necessary, always felt heavy, as though he were documenting the slow unraveling of a community. But Daisy's story was different. It wasn't about despair. It was about hope, resilience, and the quiet power of a single act of kindness. Harold picked up his pen and scrawled across the top of his notebook. "What else are we missing?" Beneath it, he began jotting ideas. More articles about the people in the town who were trying to make a difference. The hidden stories of courage and generosity that rarely made headlines. He opened a new document on his computer and started typing, the words flowing more easily than they had in years. Daisy's actions had been so small, just a coat, some gloves, a scarf, but the ripple effect was undeniable. It had moved an entire community, inspired acts of kindness, and even reignited his own sense of purpose. As Harold typed, he felt something stir in him that had long been dormant, a belief that journalism wasn't just about reporting facts. It was about amplifying voices that needed to be heard and shining a light on the goodness that still existed, even in the darkest corners. He looked at the photo of Daisy and Raymond on his screen, her small hand offering the coat, his tearful face filled with gratitude. The image was simple, but it carried a weight that words alone couldn't capture. Harold leaned forward, his fingers flying across the keyboard. This story wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter for Harper's Hollow. He vowed to tell more stories like Daisy's, to uncover the moments of quiet heroism that were slowly, quietly transforming their struggling town. When he finally leaned back, the first draft of his new piece was done. He read the closing lines aloud to himself. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the largest waves of change. Daisy Carter's generosity may have started as a simple gesture, but its impact has reminded us all of what truly matters: compassion, humanity, and hope. As Harold saved the draft and shut off his computer, a small, satisfied smile crossed his face. For the first time in years, he felt like his work had meaning. Daisy's story wasn't just about her, it was about the possibility of change, and that was a story worth telling. Despite the scrutiny, Daisy refused to waver. That night, she wrote in her journal, "It's not about what people think, it's about what's right." Helping Raymond wasn't for anyone else, it was for him. The next day, as she walked home from school, Daisy noticed several people in the park handing out warm clothes and food. The sight brought a quiet smile to her face. Her small act had already started to ripple outward, touching lives she'd never even meet. Raymond sat on the familiar park bench, the winter chill still biting at the edges of the coat Daisy had given him. He clutched the newspaper Harold Jenkins had left earlier that day, the headline, "A little girl with a big heart staring back at him." He had read the article more times than he could count, each word drawing him deeper into thoughts he'd tried to avoid for years. Daisy's words from that cold afternoon echoed in his mind. Everyone deserves to feel warm. At the time, he had dismissed them as the innocent kindness of a child, but now they lingered, challenging the wall of self-pity he had built around himself. He traced the photograph printed on the page, Daisy's small frame, her outstretched hand offering him the coat, his own tear-streaked face frozen in that moment of overwhelming gratitude. He exhaled deeply, folding the paper carefully and resting it beside him. What am I doing with my life? He wondered, his gaze drifting to the barren trees lining the park. Raymond's thoughts turned to a time when the park was a place of joy, not despair. He could see his younger self, standing behind the counter at Ray's Comfort Kitchen, the diner he had poured his heart into. It had been more than a business. It was a home for the community. He had known his regulars by name, their orders by heart. He smiled faintly, remembering how the smell of freshly baked biscuits and sizzling bacon had filled the air, how the laughter of customers had echoed against the walls. Margaret, his wife, had been the backbone of it all. Her warmth and steady optimism had kept him grounded. Then there was Amelia, Mia, as they'd called her. His daughter had been his pride, her giggles lighting up every corner of his life. She loved the diner, running between tables with a child's boundless energy, earning free cookies from the kitchen staff. But the warmth of those memories turned bitter. Margaret's sudden death in a car accident had shattered him. The grief was unbearable, and in his pain, he turned to alcohol. At first, it was just a drink to numb the ache, then another to fill the emptiness. Before long, it became his crutch, and then his master. Raymond clenched his fists, the ghost of his mistakes swirling in his mind. The diner had slipped through his fingers, the community he once served turning away. Worst of all, he had pushed Mia away, his addiction eroding the trust and love she had once freely given. The wind bit at his cheeks as Raymond stood outside the boarded-up building that used to be his diner. The faded sign above the door was barely legible, the letters chipped and worn. Ray's Comfort Kitchen, a name that once symbolized belonging, now felt like a cruel reminder of what he had lost. His reflection stared back at him from a broken window, hollow-eyed and weary. He noticed a flyer taped to the glass. Support group meeting tonight. All welcome. Raymond's hand hovered over the flyer. The words all welcome taunted him. Could he walk into a room filled with strangers and admit his failures? He pulled his hand back, shaking his head. Not yet, he muttered, turning away. The next day, Daisy found Raymond sitting on his usual bench in the park. The winter sun was weak, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Raymond was quiet, his shoulders hunched under the coat she'd given him. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of the fabric, pulling at a loose thread, his thoughts clearly miles away. "Mr. Raymond," Daisy called softly as she approached. He looked up slowly, startled at first, but his expression softened when he saw her. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice low and rough. "Didn't expect to see you today." Daisy sat beside him, clutching her scarf against the cold. "I wanted to check on you," she said. "You seemed different." Raymond chuckled faintly, though there was no humor in the sound. "Different's one way to put it," he muttered. He glanced at her, his tired eyes scanning her face. "You've been keeping busy, haven't you? Saw that article about you in the paper?" Daisy's cheeks flushed, and she looked down, scuffing her boots against the frozen ground. "I didn't know Mr. Jenkins was going to write about it," she admitted. "I just wanted to help, that's all." Raymond nodded, his gaze dropping back to the coat in his lap. "It's a good article," he said quietly. "Makes you look like a saint or something. But me?" He shook his head. "I don't belong in a story like that. If people knew half of what I've done—" Daisy frowned, leaning forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Raymond hesitated, his fingers gripping the coat tightly. "I've made mistakes, kid. Big ones. I wasn't always like this, you know. I had a family once, a business. Everything was good, until I ruined it." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, his jaw tightening. Daisy sat quietly for a moment, letting his words settle. She glanced at the park around them, the barren trees and the empty pathways before speaking. "Do you think that's all people should see? The mistakes?" Raymond's brow furrowed. "What else is there?" "You," Daisy said simply. "The you who's here now. The one who's trying." Raymond turned to her, his eyes filled with doubt. "But what if trying isn't enough? What if I'm just too far gone?" Daisy tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. She remembered something her mother had said, a phrase that had stuck with her even on her hardest days. "It's not about deserving," she said gently. "It's about trying, and I think you can." Her words hung in the air, as soft and steady as the breeze. Raymond rubbed his hands together, the warmth of the coat she'd given him seeping into his skin. "You really believe that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daisy nodded. "I do. The article wasn't just about me, Mr. Raymond. It was about how kindness can start something. Maybe it's your turn to see where it takes you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Raymond's fingers stopped fidgeting, and he let out a slow breath, watching it curl into the cold air. "Trying, huh?" he murmured. Maybe I can." Daisy smiled, standing and brushing off her coat. "I think you can too, and if you need someone to believe it with you, I'm here." Raymond looked up at her, a flicker of something new in his expression. Hope. "Thanks, kid," he said, his voice steadying. "You're a good one. You know that?" Daisy shrugged playfully. "You're not so bad yourself," she said, turning to leave. "I'll see you around, Mr. Raymond." As she walked away, Raymond stayed on the bench, staring at the path ahead. Suddenly, Daisy paused mid-step, as if struck by a sudden thought. She turned back toward Raymond, her cheeks pink from the cold and determination glinting in her eyes. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. "Here," she said, walking back to the bench and holding it out to him. Raymond hesitated, glancing between Daisy's hand and her earnest expression. "What's this?" he asked, his voice laced with both curiosity and suspicion. "It's an address," Daisy explained, her voice gentle but firm. "There's a community center a few blocks from here. They have support groups and warm meals sometimes. Mama told me about it when I asked. I thought, maybe you could check it out. Raymond stared at the paper as if it were a foreign object, his hands still gripping the coat tightly. A support group? He echoed, his tone uncertain. Yeah, Daisy said, her smile softening. I think they could help, and it might feel good to talk to someone who understands what you're going through. Raymond's fingers hovered over the paper, but he didn't take it immediately. I don't know, Daisy, he murmured. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. That's okay, Daisy replied, her voice steady. You don't have to go today or even tomorrow, but if you ever feel like trying, it's there. She leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. Sometimes, taking the first step is the hardest part. Her words carried the same quiet conviction that had pierced through his walls earlier. Raymond reached out slowly, his weathered hand brushing against hers as he took the paper. He unfolded it carefully, staring at the neat, looping handwriting that spelled out the address. What if they don't want someone like me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daisy's expression didn't waver. They will, she said simply, because everyone deserves a second chance. Raymond looked at her, his throat tightening with emotion he couldn't quite name. You believe that? I do, Daisy said with a small nod. And I think deep down, you believe it too. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cold wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sounds of the town beyond the park. Raymond folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his pocket like a fragile lifeline. Thank you, Daisy, he said finally, his voice rough but genuine. She smiled, the kind of smile that carried more hope than words ever could. You're welcome, Mr. Raymond. I'll see you soon, okay? He nodded, watching her walk away, her small frame a beacon of light against the gray winter backdrop. When she disappeared from view, Raymond pulled the paper from his pocket and stared at it again. The address felt like both a challenge and a promise, a doorway to something he hadn't dared to imagine for years. That evening, Raymond stood outside the community center. He hesitated at the door, his pulse quickening. The sound of voices inside made him feel like turning back. But Daisy's words echoed in his mind. It's about trying. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, filled with folding chairs arranged in a circle. A few people turned to look at him, their expressions welcoming but unobtrusive. First time? A man asked, standing to greet him. He introduced himself as Mr. Ellis, a graying man with kind eyes. Raymond nodded. Yeah, first time. Glad you're here, Mr. Ellis said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. As the meeting began, Raymond listened to others share their stories of loss and recovery. By the end, he found himself speaking, his voice halting but honest. When the meeting ended, Mr. Ellis lingered, handing Raymond a card. If you need someone to talk to, give me a call. I've been where you are. On his way back to the park, Raymond passed a thrift store. A handwritten sign in the window caught his eye. Help wanted. He stopped, staring at the sign for what felt like forever. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Hi, he said to the woman at the counter, his voice shaking. Are you still looking for help? She smiled. Always. Let's talk. That night, Raymond sat on his bench, clutching the schedule the woman had handed him. It was just a part-time job, but to him it was so much more. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. Daisy's kindness had lit a spark, and now it was up to him to keep it burning. The buzz surrounding Harold Jenkins' article grew louder with each passing day. What began as a small feature in the Harper's Hollow Gazette soon found its way to a regional newspaper, accompanied by an updated headline, A Little Girl's Kindness Sparks Change in Harper's Hollow. The photograph of Daisy handing the coat to Raymond captured the hearts of readers far beyond the small town. Suddenly, Harper's Hollow found itself in the spotlight. Coffee shop conversations shifted to Daisy's story, and local businesses began brainstorming ways to contribute. Church groups, civic organizations, and even a handful of skeptical townsfolk were moved by the quiet bravery of an 11-year-old girl. For Daisy, the attention felt strange and overwhelming. On her way to school, she noticed strangers smiling at her, some even stopping to say things like, "You're the kind-hearted girl, aren't you? Bless you, child." Daisy would blush and mumble her thanks, hurrying along before the compliments could settle too deeply. The growing momentum led Ruth's church to organize a fundraiser and clothing drive. Inspired by Daisy's story, the congregation came together with renewed energy. Ruth volunteered to sew scarves and gloves for the event, her worn hands moving with a purpose that seemed to lift the weight from her shoulders. At home, Daisy joined in, folding donated clothes and sorting through boxes of canned goods. The activity filled the house with a sense of hope and purpose, a rare reprieve from their usual worries. On the day of the event, the church was abuzz with activity. Tables overflowed with coats, blankets, and other essentials for those in need. The fundraiser became more than just a charitable event. It was a moment of unity for the town, a reminder of what could be achieved when people came together. Daisy stood by her mother's side, watching as people dropped off donations and exchanged warm smiles. "This feels good, doesn't it, Mama?" Daisy said, her eyes shining. Ruth looked down at her daughter, her pride evident. "It feels like hope, sweetheart." Not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Among the crowd, Mr. Grayson, the owner of a local hardware store, muttered loudly about the wastefulness of the event. "All this fuss over people who won't help themselves," he grumbled to anyone within earshot. His words sparked a quiet debate among the attendees, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disapproval. At school, the backlash took a sharper edge. Caleb Rice's teasing escalated, his voice cutting through the hallways. "Look at St. Daisy, saving the world one coat at a time," he sneered, his words laced with jealousy and mockery. Daisy tried to ignore him, but the taunt stung. "Why do you care so much about a nobody?" Caleb pressed one day in the cafeteria, his smirk daring her to respond. Before Daisy could speak, Devin Marshall stepped in. "At least she cares about something," Devin said, his voice firm. "Unlike you, Caleb." The cafeteria fell silent, all eyes on the two boys. Caleb rolled his eyes but didn't push further, retreating to his table with a muttered, "Whatever." Daisy shot Devin a grateful look. "Thank you," she whispered. Devin smiled. "Anytime." To Daisy's surprise, Raymond arrived at the fundraiser. He lingered near the edge of the crowd, his nervousness clear as he adjusted the scarf around his neck. Ruth spotted him first, offering a warm smile that encouraged him to step closer. When Harold approached with a microphone, Raymond hesitated but eventually nodded. Standing before the gathered crowd, he cleared his throat, his voice trembling at first but growing steadier as he spoke. "I don't have much to give," Raymond began, his gaze fixed on the ground. "But Daisy's kindness, it gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She didn't look at me like I was invisible. She reminded me that I can try again. And I'm trying." That's all I wanted to say. The crowd erupted in applause, many moved to tears by his honesty. Even those who had been skeptical felt a shift in their hearts. Harold stood near the back of the room, taking it all in. His notebook was filled with observations, but he found himself setting it aside. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. Daisy's actions had sparked something larger, a collective recognition of the power of small kindnesses. Later, he approached Ruth, his recorder in hand. "What do you think of everything that's happening?" he asked. Ruth smiled softly. "I'm proud of Daisy. She has a heart bigger than this whole town. But," her voice grew quieter, "kindness can be heavy. I just hope she knows she doesn't have to carry it alone." Harold nodded, jotting down her words. They stayed with him long after the fundraiser ended. Toward the end of the event, the pastor announced that a portion of the funds raised would be distributed to families in need, including the Carters. Ruth's eyes widened, and she immediately shook her head. "I don't want charity," she said firmly. "I can earn my share. I'll sew for anyone who needs it. Coats, gloves, blankets. Just let me work for it." Her humility and determination inspired murmurs of admiration among the crowd. Several attendees approached her afterward, requesting her services and offering fair pay. That night, Daisy sat on her bed, her journal open on her lap. Her pencil hovered above the page as she tried to put her thoughts into words. "When I gave Mr. Raymond that coat, I never thought it would turn into this. People are helping each other, smiling at each other more. It feels good, but what if it doesn't last? What if things go back to the way they were? She closed the journal, the question lingering in her mind. Ruth entered the room, sitting beside her on the bed. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Daisy hesitated, then shared her worry. "What if it doesn't change anything in the end?" Ruth wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Even if the world doesn't change completely, you've made a difference to one person. And sometimes that's enough to start something beautiful." Daisy leaned into her mother's embrace, the weight of her doubt easing. "I hope you're right, Mama." "I know I am," Ruth said with a gentle smile. As Daisy drifted off to sleep, the sound of Ruth's sewing machine hummed softly in the background. Across town, Harold sat at his desk, typing the headline for his next article, "How One Girl Inspired a Town." He felt a rare sense of purpose, determined to keep the momentum alive. The morning sun peeked through the thin curtains in the Carter household as Ruth sifted through the mail. Most of it was the usual, a utility bill, a coupon flyer, but one envelope stood out. It was crisp and official looking, addressed to Daisy Carter in bold, elegant letters. Ruth frowned in curiosity and called out, "Daisy, you've got mail." Daisy shuffled into the kitchen, her hair slightly mussed from sleep. "Me?" she asked, surprised. She took the envelope, turning it over in her hands before carefully tearing it open. As she unfolded the letter inside, her eyes scanned the words, widening with every line. Her breath caught as she read aloud. "Dear Miss Carter, we are delighted to inform you that you have been nominated for the Bright Futures Educational Scholarship by the Kindness in Action Foundation. Your story of generosity and compassion, as shared in Harold Jenkins's article, has inspired countless individuals and serves as a powerful reminder of the difference one person can make." Daisy's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. "Mama, I don't understand. A scholarship? For me?" Ruth's face crumpled with emotion as she pulled Daisy into a tight embrace. "Oh, sweetheart, this is wonderful." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she held her daughter close. "You've earned this. You've earned every bit of this." "But I didn't do anything big," Daisy murmured, still processing the news. "Why would they choose me?" Ruth stepped back, cupping Daisy's face in her hands. "Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that make the biggest difference," she said gently. "You showed them what kindness looks like, and they saw the beauty in that." Later that afternoon, Harold Jenkins knocked on the Carter family's door, his signature notebook tucked under one arm. Ruth welcomed him inside, and he smiled warmly at Daisy. "I heard the good news," he said, his eyes shining with pride. "Congratulations, Daisy." Daisy blushed, tucking her hair behind her ear. "Thank you, Mr. Harold. But did you have something to do with this?" Harold chuckled. "I wrote the article, but you're the one who did all the work. The foundation board read your story and couldn't stop talking about it. They said your kindness reminded them of what really matters." Daisy tilted her head, puzzled. "But why does it matter so much?" "Because kindness is contagious," Harold explained. "Your courage to help one person inspired others to act, and that's more powerful than you realize." That evening, Daisy sat at her desk, pen in hand, writing a thank you letter to the foundation. "Dear Bright Futures Foundation, thank you for this incredible honor. I'm so grateful for your belief in me. But I want you to know this scholarship isn't just for me. It's for everyone who believes in kindness and second chances. I learned from Mr. Raymond that helping one person can create a ripple effect, touching lives we may never see. Thank you for helping me continue to dream of making a difference." The next morning, Daisy strolled to the park, clutching the scholarship letter in her hands. The crisp air carried a sense of promise, and she felt the weight of her journey settling into something brighter. As she neared the familiar bench, she spotted Raymond sitting tall, his coat buttoned neatly, his demeanor radiating a quiet confidence. "Mr. Raymond," Daisy called out, her voice warm and cheerful as she waved. Raymond looked up and broke into the warmest smile she'd ever seen from him. "Hey there, kiddo," he greeted, standing to meet her halfway. "Heard the big news. You're going to be famous now, huh? Daisy giggled, tucking her letter into her pocket. Not famous, just really, really lucky. Raymond shook his head, his expression softening. No, Daisy, not lucky. You earned this. Every single bit of it. As they sat down together, Raymond reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small weathered box. Opening it with care, he revealed a delicate silver pendant shaped like a star, its edges catching the morning light. This belonged to my wife, Margaret, he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with emotion. She always said it reminded her that even in the darkest times, there's always a light. And Daisy, you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. So I want you to have this. Daisy stared at the pendant, her small hands trembling as she reached for it. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she whispered, I can't take this, Mr. Raymond. It's too special. Raymond smiled, his eyes kind. It's special because it represents hope. And if anyone deserves to carry that light, it's you. Daisy nodded, clutching the pendant tightly to her chest. Thank you, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. You've come a long way, Mr. Raymond, she said after a moment, her grin returning. So have you, Raymond replied with a chuckle. But I'm not done yet. I've got work to do, more support group meetings, staying steady at the diner, and earning Mia's forgiveness. If a little girl can change a man's life, then this man can work to change his own. Daisy smiled again, holding up the pendant. And I'll keep this to remind me that hope never runs out. Raymond laughed, his voice lighter than it had been in years. You do that, kiddo. As Daisy stood to leave, she paused and looked back at him. You've helped me too, Mr. Raymond. I hope you know that. Raymond's smile deepened, his heart swelling with gratitude. I do now. Daisy walked away, the pendant swinging gently in her hand as sunlight broke through the trees, casting golden streaks across the park. She felt a quiet resolve in her steps, her heart full of possibilities she hadn't dared to dream of before. From the bench, Raymond watched her leave, his own heart lighter than it had been in decades. The hope Daisy had given him wasn't just for today. It was a light he knew would guide him through the rest of his journey. And so Daisy's small act of kindness became the light that changed not just one life, but an entire community. From Raymond's second chance to the ripple effects of her compassion, this story reminds us of a simple truth. No act of kindness is ever too small to make a difference. But what about you? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where someone's small gesture created a big change? What would you have done if you were in Daisy's shoes or even Raymond's? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation about kindness and second chances going, because your perspective could inspire someone else to act. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories of hope, resilience, and compassion to share with you. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember the smallest light can shine the brightest in the darkest of times.